Okay, hello everyone. This is Riccardo Mazzini, and here we are. Okay, some small technical details. I thank you very much, and thanks also, and mainly the Georgetown University Wargaming Society for this opportunity to have this event, this presentation with you. The title of the presentation is maybe a bit strange, crossing the line and not so perilous journey towards the hidden realm of non-linear simulation. And this may look like a weird term to someone, but other people already know how much non-linear a simulation game and simulation in general can be. But before we start, very small introduction of myself, and I am a wargame content creator, YouTube channel, podcasts, and articles for magazines, but also online articles for website, and also an organizer of public gaming events with a big historical at Modena Play, but also other events. My YouTube channel is called Blog, and podcast is called Checkpoint Charlie. I've also written some articles for paper magazines like Io Gioco and Parabellum, which are Italian magazines, Punched, Conflicts of Interest, and of course, C3I, that I think most of our audience will know. But also, I made my contributions also with specialized websites, but also I am an author, an academic author. I am a member of the Italian Military History Society, and I've written together with my father and also by myself several essays and books about military history, but also academic articles on academic magazines and series, mostly regarding the relationship between simulation games and historical research, essentially looking at simulation games like tools for historical research. But I also have written books and essays specifically about games, Guerre di Carta 2.0, Paper Wars 2.0, which is the second edition of the first book, which was written by my father in 1979. We have written that together in 2018, I think, yes. So to see the updates. But also other books about public history, and the books that possibly is most relevant here, and it is Il Gioco di Arianna, Ariadne's game, that is essentially about non-linear simulation and forms the basis for this research that I am showing you, this ongoing research. Also, I am the curator for some upcoming projects, Euro Wargames, together with Fred Serval, that you should know, he has already been here, and Jan Heinemann, that is an anthology of articles about wargaming in Europe and not just Europe, and also La Storia Movimento 2019, History in Motion 2019. It was a conference between wargamers and historical researchers and historical authors here in Rome, and we have collected all those contributions to that event. But also, of course, I am a wargamer, so it is here you can see me in action. So after this presentation, we have already heard the term nonlinear simulation, and let's start. What is a nonlinear simulation? Oh, one thing, a bit of methodology. I decided to apply a very useful method, that is the 5W method for my exposition. So you will see what, who, where, when, etc., etc. First point: what is a nonlinear simulation? The first, let's start from what is a simulation. Okay, let's divide the problem into some smaller elements. Of course, I'm sorry. Of course, I'm not an English native speaker, so you will forgive me for the odd Italianism here and there. But I learned to speak English and read and speak English to wargames when I was a child. So my own is I like to call it my SPI English. It was all faults of Jim Dunnigan's. of course. But after that, what is a simulation? Since I am an Italian, I'm sorry, we start with just a little bit of Latin, but it is necessary. Simulation comes from the Latin simul actio, a similar action, an action that is similar to what? Reality. How this can be similar, how this process can happen, how can we have an action similar to another action? There are very different approaches to this. Digital was analog. Do I just take the mathematical elements, probability elements of a reality, and then create mathematical functions? So I have a model, a simulation. Or do I go the analog way? I try to recreate a very similar situation. Essentially, Leibniz was Aristotle. And also quantitative was qualitative, or as Philip Sabin wrote in his great book, Simulating War, his idea of war was a qualitative idea of war, was the Lancastrian equations, as he called them. That is the study of war as a mathematical relation, the famous 3-to-1 ratio odds. You'll see that simulation games, using games that is interactive, free models to recreate a reality, is a process as old as humanity itself. Johan Huizinga, great game studies author and historian anthropologist, considers games as the starting point of human culture. Games create rituals, create a world outside the material world, and so that is culture. Greg Kostikian, many years after, wrote that game design is a form of art, almost a necessity, as art is. We have also to conclude that art may be considered a form of game design, if this equation is true. But most of all, simulation is a game inside the world and outside the world, and not just like other games that are abstract, less just checkers, for example. Those games create a world of their own. They have no direct reference reality. But simulation games have that reference reality. So they stay out of the world, as Johan Huizinga would have said, a world of their own, but they have a very strict relationship with the real world because they want to recreate the real world. And for Huizinga, this may be surprising. For Huizinga, essentially all games are simulation games. There are various degrees, but as I said, in games, the material world is recreated in the image of rules and ideals. When those rules and ideas are abstract, we have abstract games. But when those rules and ideals recreate essentially the material reference reality, we have a simulation game. As in essence, humankind essential life as a whole can be defined by its, Huizinga calls it recreational potential, the possibility of recreating reality. But there is no simulation without reference reality. This is one of the first differences between the various types of games. So, second question, what is reality anyway? We tend to see reality as a form of cause and effect relations, time and space relations, force and not in presence and absence relations. And here we go with the Westmoreland dilemma. We all know the famous phrase that Westmoreland was playing chess while Ho Chi Minh was playing Go. But Westmoreland was not playing chess in Vietnam, was not considering reality as a chessboard. He was playing the war games created by the Rand corporations, the first or second generation war games that were essentially quantitative. So they still believed in a linear recreation of time and space. This is the problem. The problem is that reality does not work that way. Reality is not a war game. A war game can approach reality, but reality is not at all like a war game. This was the first misconception. Why? Because if a simulation is a form of knowledge, so a tool that we use to know something, we have to remember that every form of knowledge is an abstraction. We take material data and then we create models, or even worse, a simplification. I don't want to go too deep into philosophy, but there are two very important philosophers, Hume and Kant, and essentially they said that all our knowledge is limited. We cannot understand the nature of cause and effect, and have that cause and effect relationship described exactly every single way. We cannot have perfect models. Why? Because an infinite and not entirely knowable reality calls for infinite and not entirely knowable methods of simulating it, that is playing it. A simulation cannot know it all. If we cannot know it all about reality, we cannot create a simulation, which is a secondary product of our intelligence, to create a perfect reality. A nonlinear approach accepts these limits, stops pretending to know it all, and accepts rational intuition as a viable quantitative process, and just tries to reproduce reality as best as it can or it can't. And is very, very aware of its own limits. How? Well, let's just see by looking at the relationship between simulation and reality. Here we come with Jim Dunnigan. Once again, a model duplicates a function in great detail and exactitude. A simulation is a model that can move in many different directions. A war game is a playable simulation. As you're beginning to see models in motions, they're not static and they're not finite. There are many things that happen inside a model, but that cannot be fully described. We have some first criterions, mechanics and content, the relationship between game mechanics, that is the functions of the model, and the content, that is the reference reality and how the game represents it. And this essentially in Eurogames, the priority is on the mechanics, while the content is a secondary element. In simulation games and war games, mechanics are subservient to the representation of the content. It is the content that dictates which mechanics we should use, not the other way around. And this gives you the difference between thematic and themed. But also another dichotomy, which is very false. Detailed mechanics and content should not be seen as an opposition. They are just two polar opposites. Another false dichotomy, details with effect. If we accept the nonlinear nature of simulation, that is, that simulation cannot recreate reality in all its details, we see that every good design for detail should be for effect too. Why? Because reality is the ultimate effect. If we cannot know every single detail, we know the consequences of our actions in reality. So we have to stop at the consequences of our actions, of our decisions in simulation. Why this is important? This is very important because we have to avoid a pitfall, the simulation for simulation's sake. Yeah, we don't have to create great, perfect models and fall in love with them. Why? Because if we do that, if you try to create too linear, too predictable, too accurate, too precise models, we get far away from reality, because reality is not precise, is not linear, is not accurate. But most of all, our knowledge of reality, that is the relation between simulation and reality, is not perfect. If we try to create a perfect simulation, we are not simulating reality anymore, because perfection is not of this world. I know this is a bit theoretical concept, but they give us the necessary framework. Another proof of that is another conception by Jim Dunnigan, the difference between computer games, digital games, and analog simulation games is the difference between hardware and malware. Hardware is a computer, and software is the program that runs on the computer. And those two things are the engine of computer games. Without them, they cannot work. Analog simulation games, tabletop simulation games, use malware, that is our brain, our imagination, our cognitive processes, but also our knowledge of the rules. We are the engine of those analog games. As you see, computer games and analog games have two very different engines. Computer games, they have a digital engine. Tabletop games have an analog engine. And since reality is analogic, does not work in digital way, can be represented in digital way, but does not work in digital way. That is why tabletop games, with all their imperfections, all their abstraction, their limits, are far superior forms of simulation, just because of this non-linear nature of reality. And now we get to the last point of this part of the presentation, the importance of method. There was a story. Everybody knows that Alexander the Great had a great teacher, that is Aristotle himself. Not everybody knows that Aristotle was very fond of a game, that is Peteia. Peteia is the game of footmen in Greek, and Socrates had taught Aristotle that game, and Aristotle was mad for this game. This game represented more or less in a symbolic way, in a metaphorical way, a battle between two phalanxes of Greek soldiers. So we'll see. So we could say, wow. So Alexander, by playing Peteia with Aristotle, was actually playing war games. War games. Alexander the Great was a war gamer, but they were not war games. And here we see why. And this is another very important part of our exploration. Why? Because a simulation does not work just by recreating something that's reminiscent of a reality. Simulation has a very precise flow. I tried to simplify it here, but essentially it has three moments: reproduction, that is the idea of inserting all the data or the information, all the details that we know inside the model; representation, that is putting them into motion, putting those elements into motion and depicting their dynamics, their interactions, and most of all, their interaction with the player decision; and repetition, that is, we must create a model that can be repeated by having that model do similar things, we should have similar results. Around this flow, there are some other forces around. You see, historical and analytical research leads to reproduction. You have to do research before creating a simulation. You have to research the data, the information. Between reproduction and representation, there is player agency. A player must be involved. Otherwise, if a player is not involved, it is not a simulation. It is a reenactment. It is a reconstruction, but there is no player agency. There is no interaction. Between representation and repetition, there must be outcomes, but those outcomes must be plausible. A simulation cannot be arbitrarily random. Random, that a simulation must have a ponderated randomness, that is a random that has a relationship with the actual situation. Those plausible outcomes lead to repetition, to the possibility of having similar results, and that repetition over time gives us model validity. We see that this simulation, okay, it is a good model. It works. It can give me, if not, cannot predict the future, but can be good insights on a situation. Cannot let me discover why Napoleon lost at Waterloo, but I have a good depiction of the dynamics that led to Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo. This is the core of simulation. And tendentially, in a linear simulation, a probabilistic simulation, a classic X encounter war game, you have just a straight line going from reproduction, representation, and repetition. The problem is that it is in a non-linear simulation, just like those that we will see. You have one line that goes that way, then there are another oscillating line, then there are parallel or divergent lines, broken lines, circular lines, cycles. So a non-linear simulation has many different directions. And some of those lines are pointing directly at you because they are they are engaging you and engaging different processes, lateral thinking, analogic thinking. So it is much wider. We have to see that, you have to say that also in a linear probabilistic simulation, in a linear probabilistic wargame, those things, there is not just that line. Many lines are hidden. Oh yes, and there are also invisible lines. So as you can see, this is a general simplification of the process. Another simplification can see that we have three different types of simulation. I like to call them the three kingdoms of the simulation. That is, the first one is the deterministic simulation, chess and fixed resolution games. Method, the main challenge for the players, resource management. You have your assets, you have to manage them well. The attitude, the psychological attitude that is challenged is resistance. You have to resist the action of the adversary, or your opponent. And the general challenge is mechanical complexity. They can be complex because they have many rules. Those rules, every pawn has its own rules, has its own rules. So it is a mechanical complexity. You have to understand the combinations, the mechanics, just the mechanic interactions between the different elements of the game. Second kingdom is the probabilistic simulation, traditional war games and statistical resolution games. This action has 20%, 30%, 40% probability of success. The main method to approach those games is risk management. I calculate my risk, I try to manage them, I try to calculate them, and then I go, but also I have my plan B, plan C, etc. if everything goes wrong. The attitude, or a small mistake, the attitude here is resilience, okay? I have to oppose I already have a more dynamic interaction with my opponent, and the challenge is dynamic complexity. But nonlinear simulation, and here we go, alternative war games and other interrelated resolution games. You see, first example, Undaunted. You have a very linear representation where people are, but they act to cards, and you build those deck of cards, those deck of actions. The method is situational and interactional management. You manage both the situation and the interaction. So the attitude is resilience, but also resistance. Resistance and resilience combined. You have to combine the deterministic challenges and the probabilistic challenges. It is a much more organic environment, and the challenge here is organic complexity. Why? Because you're not just dealing with probabilities, you're not just dealing with positions on the chessboard, you are dealing with many different parallel levels of simulation, of friction, of different kind of randomness, all acting together at once. We must not, and this leads us, an organic environment leads us to the very center of a nonlinear simulation, which is not a simulation itself, is the gamers, games and gamers. Here we can mention two great authors of game studies. The first one we have already encountered. Huizinga, Art, Laws, and Rituals are very elaborated forms of gaming. In his work, in his main work, Homo Ludens, but also Roger Caillois. And Caillois focuses on the psychology of gamers, what drives people to games. In Léger, Les Hommes, Games and Men. They are two different approaches, one starting from the game, another from the gamers, but they all try to represent the inner core of games and most also of nonlinear simulation games, that is the gamers themselves. We see that starting from the deterministic games to non-linear simulation games, we come from objective game mechanics that are just internal to the game itself, to subjective game player dynamics. That is more relation between what happens inside the mind and the imagination of the player and the nature of the game, and also player between players, but we will see that. As every form of human enterprise, a game is just as good as its authors and its players. That is why nonlinear simulations, which are a much more organic kind of game, can actually succeed or fail also because the attitude of the players. They are much more fragile in this respect. I like to say the game lies in the eyes, all the eyes of the gamer. They require a different form of involvement. But just to sum up, this is the first theoretical part of the exposition. A conclusion as well as a premise: there is no better or worse game, only your own game that suits your own personal and practical expectation and purposes in that particular moment of your life and work, as a player as well as a designer. I'm not saying that non-linear simulations are better than linear simulation or deterministic games. They are very different. There is no ladder of value. There is no escalation of value. There is just a different approach to what a game is, and if this game must be a simulation, and what kind of simulation, and which parts of reality this game should represent. There are situations that are much better served by linear probabilistic simulation because they're much clearer, they are less confused, but there are other situations that require a non-linear approach. As always, depends on what are your expectation, needs, and purposes as a gamer, but also as a game designer. And this is up to you to choose. This is just a spectrum of possibilities. So we have seen this theoretical part, which might seem a bit hard, but in essence, it is reality is complex. Our knowledge is limited. If we try to represent everything to probabilities, we will get distortions over distortions. And worst of all, we will get a false sense of success. If we want to represent certain aspects of reality, we have to use another approach, a non-linear approach, that is an approach that integrates probabilities and also interactions and multi-level, multi-dimensional approaches to simulation. We have to simulate many more things at once than just the famous 3-to-1 force ratio. Second part, when non-linear simulation began to appear, this helps us in understanding possibly what a nonlinear simulation is. When did they appear first? Well, we got them much sooner than we would expect. The first forms of the nonlinear simulation are actually the first Indian games that we know, that is the Chaturanga, Chaturaji, Shatranji. They are the games of four. They were the ancestors of chess, and many forms of them were played by using dice with different squares of the chessboard that represented different terrains. A game of four. Why? Because there were four players playing with alliances and conflicts, but also the four main weapon specialization of the Indian army. But what happened? Chaturanga, Chatraji, Shatranji, they came to Persia, and they became the shamat. But in Persia, and also to Greece, to Alexander, as we have seen, they became also Peteia. They found environments in which dice and alia and randomness were badly considered. In Greece, it was seen as a lack of strategy. In Persia, and then in Christendom, and then in the Islamic world, the dice, the randomness were considered negative from a religious point of view. But those dice still survived, even in the Christian world that inherited the shamat and then got the chess, the same game. And we have a great source that is El Libro de los Juegos, the book of games by King Alphonse the Wise of Spain. And in this book, we are in the 14th century, or even before, we are in medieval Spain. But in this book, King Alphonse describes three types of games: chessboard games, dice games that are just random random dice games, but juegos de las tablas, that is tabletop games. We could board games, we could translate it, that integrate the deterministic and strategy elements of the chessboard with the dice. And King Arthur says those are the most elevated form of games. Why? Because they are a good representation of reality that can give you a good sense of what strategy really is, because war has random elements, so we have to include random elements in those games that try to represent war. Also, the medieval cultural environment had many of the first elements of war games, the ars combinatoria, Ramon-Lul, and the Rhythmomachia, that is the games that were based on mathematical interactions, probabilities, and statistics, coming to Leibniz, that famously said in a letter, if I could calculate probabilities well enough, I could create a game for generals and colonels representing battles and wars. This is mentioned in the zones of control introduction. And we are here at the probabilistic games stage. We come to the 18th century and the very early 19th century, and we have von Clausewitz. Von Clausewitz introduces the study of friction, that is non-ponderable elements in reality and in military operation. We will see them very soon. And says that war looks not like chess, is not similar to chess. War is much more similar to a card game. And it explains the fear of military chess, that is, those games that started from chess and tried to represent battles and the military science and military art of war, that proliferated in the end of the 18th century, because people were aware there was a need for a game that could represent reality, and especially the military reality. But those games failed because they still maintained the absolute deterministic nature of chess. But common the Prussians, von Reiswitz and many others. But we remember the Kriegspiel. The Kriegspiel, classic Prussian war game, used dice, used ponderated randomness together with this scientific topography, and also arbiters, referees, human mediation, fog of war, and many other elements. Finally had a plausible, a believable reproduction of war. So believable that, well, the British at the time, they were in opposition with the Germans, tried to react to this great proliferation of Kriegspiel, which became very famous because it was used, actively used in military planning of actual military operation. Everybody in Europe was trying to understand this secret of the Prussian army. Albert Wells, The Little Wars, his war game, his idea of war game. In Little Wars, his famous text, he showed us the first consolidated review book for three-dimensional miniature wargaming. But the approach was very different. The approach here was not to have a game that should be used for war, but a game that should show the horrors of war. There was a political intent. It was a pacifist game. And it was a toy game. This game wanted to represent another phase of war. But Kriegspiel continued, and the Prussians still got on. And Julius Verdi du Vernois, the name is French, but he was Prussian, created the free Kriegspiel. And here we come closer to nonlinear simulation. What is free Kriegspiel? Free Kriegspiel is a Kriegspiel in which all the events, all the interactions are adjudicated not just by dice, but by discussion. The players discuss the choices with the other players and with the referees. And the referees adjudicate the events, determines the outcomes of the choices based also on that discussion or on their own evaluation of the situation. So not just by statistical tables and dice and special dice and so on. As you see, this gives us a much broader environment for simulation, a much broader spectrum of possible applications of simulation. Yes, we are including now economic and political and social elements inside the simulation, but we are also including many more arbitrary elements. Why? Because those evaluations could not be fair, could not be right, and so they became more vague. But free Kriegspiel was actually universally used by the now German army and the now German political staff of the late 19th and early 20th century. Part of World War I was also planned on free Kriegspiel basis, and it had its own problems. After the war wars, what happened? Well, during the war wars, war games were widely used, a very wide variety of war games. Matt Caffrey on Wargaming has a very good list of the different types of war games and generations of war games. Von Moltke was an active wargamer. He was the president of a wargame club, of a civilian wargame club. Von Schlieffen, the planner of the first attack in 1914, was obsessed with war games, and he had the famous motto, reinforce the right, because all these war games showed him how the first attack from Germany to France had to have its focal point on the coast, on the northern part of of France, to encircle Paris. This did not happen. The result, Battle of the Marne and 4 years of trench warfare. But also the famous history of overzealous Japanese admirals, Admiral Ugaki before Midway, the war game before Midway, junior officers with their own decisions actually sank 3 out of 4 Japanese carriers in the war games leading up to the Midway operation. Admiral Ogaki was the referee for the operation, said, no, I'm re-adjudicating those dice. It's just a stroke of luck. This cannot happen. The American US carriers cannot be there, cannot be aware of our own position. Results are obvious. And also the famous phrase by Nimitz. Nimitz afterwards said, we have already seen everything that we have done in war during our pre-war simulation. There was just one thing that we did not foresee, that was kamikaze attacks. And kamikaze are a typical non-linear element, because organized mass suicidal attacks against your fleet are not exactly something that a linear simulation can represent. After the war, first elements of games that are not just symbolic, mainstream games that are not just symbolic representation, was just like Stratego could be Alan B. Calamar's Diplomacy in 1959, a game about the different relations between nations. And then we come to war games. Charles Roberts, his famous history, how he got called by Rand Corporation because they could not understand how he could have designed such an accurate CRT, combat results table. And he came to the Rand Corporation headquarters and showed them that he just produced it out of common sense and of his personal military experience and his knowledge of military history. But while he was there, he took the idea of using hexagons for maps. Interesting thing, hexagon come from Neumann, from the great mathematician von Neumann, while counters, the idea of writing the values on the counters, come from John Nash. So this was the environment in which Rand was operating. We have Avalon Hill, we have many games of Avalon Hill, but in the late 60s, here comes Mr. Dunningham. with a simple letter to the magazine of Avalon said, okay, I like your biology game, but it is not historical for me. It's too much of a game, it lacks some historical elements. And Avalon said, okay, why don't you show us your designs? And Mr. Danigan produced Jutland. Jutland is a game about the Battle of Jutland with ships moving on a free map, on a free floor, without rules, without a grid, using silhouettes and rulers, but using a very linear, that is dice, combat resolution. And after, Danigan produced many other games, of course, for SPI, World War I, the American Revolution, Origins of World War II, and Plot to Assassinate Hitler. Many games that in some ways created mechanics that are used in Eurogames even today. And that Euro war games were a thing even before Eurogames were born. World War I is very interesting because it is a representation of World War I in which you can avoid a retreat by expending manpower points. And you lose when you have spent all your manpower points. So the decision is up to you. Do you leave that position or do you expand human life? But you have a very limited quantity of human life. Yes, it is cynical, but it is incredibly effective. And after his experience at SPI, James Danigan wrote the Complete Wargames Handbook, which did not create wargame theory, but gave it a great framework, a great conceptual framework. And it is still absolutely necessary, more than reference work. History continued, and the conception of war changed, and also how we see war changed. Once again, coming back to Westmoreland, once again, Chess and Go, try to compare Vietnam for Victory Games to Fire in the Lake. Two different games in two very different historical periods, designed in two very different historical periods, but with two very different conceptions of war. Or 1776 by Avalon Hill and Liberty or Death, the con game by Harold Buchanan, the American Insurrection, not a revolution, insurrection. And it is completely different. Why? Because there is a completely different conception. There is a completely different vision of those conflicts. This does not mean that Vietnam by Victory Games and 1776 are not good games. They are just another approach. Now, the evolution of our concept of war, of history, is changing also how we design and play games, simulation games, even if classical, old school simulation games are perfectly valid instruments. They just represent other sectors of reality. That is why I say one word, one game, one vision. Is simulation just a snapshot of what is seen in the moment of the design, a history of simulation games? So looking how simulation games evolve in history is a history how the world is seen in those particular moments, how people around the world see what is happening, the wars, the conflicts, economies, and society. This is a topic in which my dear friend Andrea Angiolino has made, yes, the designer of Wings of War, but he is also a great game scholar, has made many researches by researching how the nature of games relates to the nature of the society that produces those games. And we see the evolution of professional gaming. We come from the first ranked war games to RPG elements thrown in, serious game, intelligence gathering games. Yes, the wars by Klopper and Volker Runke, matrix games, mega games. You see many games in which there are not just dice and tables, but there is interaction, there is human interaction, there are dealings, there are discussions, there are different expositions, and there is free adjudication, much closer to free Kriegspiel. But also commercial games has evolved from military simulations, so just focus on military elements, that is X and counter, traditional X and counter games, to political military games, Cohen series, to military political games, that is games like Paths of Glory or Empire of the Sun, that are still focused on the military elements, but also introduce political elements and political elements. European turmoil, rise of totalitarianism, that is a simulation of how political and cultural movements lead to the different historical events, the different historical facts that may also happen, may also have as a consequence war. The prime example of this evolution is, of course, Twilight Struggle, which is a real classic. Why? It is interesting because it is a war game for me. Twilight Struggle, it is absolutely a war game because there are wars happening everywhere, and Cold War is another kind of war, but it's a war game that ends when actual war breaks out. Because if nuclear war breaks out, that is actual all-out war, the game is over. It just remains to see who has lost, who has won. But Third World War is not played on Twilight Struggle, and is a very important element of the game. But it's also important that this element of a game that does not exist because it does not happen still has a great influence on how the game is played, because everybody is trying to avoid that element that we know will not be represented in the game. Now non-linear is that. This creates a tension that it is not in the rules, but it is the player decisions, in the player strategy, and it is above and beyond the rules themselves. And it is also a great element of historical representation, because this was exactly a way of thinking of those politicians that fought against each other in the Cold War. We must have a position of predominance, but we must avoid war at all costs. Why? Because this kind of war will be the end of it all. Of course, another important step, CDG revolution, the card games. All these would have not been possible without Mark Herman, and then after him, Volker Ranke, Brian Train, and all the other authors. Card-driven games, the great lesson by Volker Ranke on the importance of cards, on simulation games. I've seen here on the Georgetown University. It's absolutely paramount. Cards introduce complex dynamics with a small impact, strategic initiative, literary deception, political context. They allow you to directly manipulate probability, introduce bluff as a nonlinear strategy. They focus on non-kinetic elements. They are actually a CRT that you directly influence with your decisions. You are constantly shifting columns. They are just like a CRT in which you do not see the different columns, but by playing this or that card, you are shifting, constantly shifting of a column. They have a greater explicit representation than in traditional probabilistic simulation. This is a very important fact. Those kind of games, they represent the dynamics that lead to events, to the evolution of events directly, explicitly. In a linear simulation, many of those dynamics are abstracted with the roll of a die. That is, a table, one happen, if I roll one, this happens. If I roll six, this happens. But I also only the consequences. I do not have a direct, explicit, and also manipulable, manageable depiction of the entire process that leads from this cause to this event. We get back to humankind. Card-driven games are, for me, are even more complete forms of simulations, because they let you get inside this process, and also they open the door to hybridation in games, in game designs, and in game public. Paul Kruger said that he created the coin series to fight against tribalism. That is the division in categories and subcategories of gamers. It is a very modern thing, because if you see the catalog of 1960s, 1970s, and even the early 1980s, you do not see these great differentiations between categories. And the game mechanics, this approach gives game mechanics another a renewed value as design tools, not as gender-defining elements. There are interventions by Herman Ranke and David Thompson on the subject. Game mechanics should not become the defining element of a game genre. That is, X and counter are not a gender, a kind of war games. They are design tools. A war game is a kind of game, but X and counter is just a mechanic. You can have X and counter war games, you can have point-to-point war games, you can have card-driven war games. It is just a mechanic, it is a tool. Some tools are better for some purposes, other tools are better for other purposes. Some purposes require more linear instruments, more probabilistic instruments. Other tools require more organic and non-linear elements. It all depends, as we already said, it all depends on your purposes, on your needs, on your expectations on the game. And it all started with Magic the Gathering, by the way, because Mark Emmons all said that his first card-driven game design with the people was derived from a game of Magic the Gathering with his daughter. So as you see, the hybridation is internal to the nature of these kind of games. Very quickly, post-CDG simulations after the boom, the great boom of classic, what now we call classic card-driven games. We have had many other games, card-driven, card assist, card nest, and many variations. We had chain activation games like W1815, Chasselos 1863, Table Battles, the Pax series games, negotiation games, all just the entire, almost an entire catalog of Ola Spiele, and that is a great publisher. And Euro war games. The category of Euro war games are just a bit more than just deck building and fancy components. We have few acres of snow that represented the French and Indian War mostly as a colonization effort, as an economical effort. And it is a very interesting approach to the representation of the French Indian War. Of course, Undaunted, that finally teaches us the importance of recon soldiers. If you do not recon a tile in Undaunted, you do not go into that tile. And finally, recon troops are useful troops. 300 and earth and water. That is the progress of the great Japanese game designers. It is a word in great evolution. And as a final, I can give you a final example of the evolution of Napoleonic games. This is a subgenre of war games. You start with Napoleon's Last Battles. This is a traditional X and counter war games. Great game, by the way, in which there are no cards. Why? Because cards are not for real war games. Real war games, they just have maps and counters, and they're fine with them. Then you get with Napoleon and in general the block games, and you rediscover the fog of war of Kriegspiel. Then you come to the Charcot series, the Napoleon series by Charcot, and blocks and cards. You have blocks, and even the cards go well together. And after that comes the library simultaneous to that, because this is not an after or a before. Parallel to that, we have the library of Napoleonic Battles, that is the evolution of Napoleon's Last Battles, that has an optional rule for cards. That is actually cards, possibly for real war gamers. And the author is the same, Kevin Zaka, and we will meet him again. We will meet him again quite soon. Here the third part. Where can we find nonlinear elements in a simulation? Actually, many words, but what are the game mechanics that should be considered nonlinear? Many of them also belong to the traditional X and counter war games. As we said, also traditional X and counter war games have many nonlinear elements. The hexagon is a rounded square for the resulting algebra to represent the diagonal movement. The CRT is one of the very first examples of design for effect. We know the result of the table. We do not know the dynamic. We do not see them actually represented on the table. We just see the effects. And also, we also have event tables that replace the card X to introduce special effects. But also the general approach. They are counterfactual. War games were born out of counterfactually, or how history should be studied with ifs. If this happened, if Napoleon won at Waterloo, what would have happened to Europe? That is exactly the area of a traditional war game. And traditional war games were mostly born to give answers to those hypothetical scenarios or counterfactual scenarios. The tale as a mean and not an end to itself. We have seen not simulation for simulation's sake, but simulation to represent the world. A constant drive towards innovation experimentation, which was constant in the 1960s and 1970s, and also at the leading edge of wizard interfaces. A word for Redmond Simonson, who described himself as a physical and graphical system designer and engineer. But the last point is, once again, the player as the ultimate game designer. The importance of storytelling in war games, the importance of narrative, exploiting the difference between open and closed source algorithms. Computers have closed source algorithms. I cannot change the algorithm of a computer war game, not beyond the extension of what the game designer allowed me. But analog tabletop war games are open, use open algorithms. I know them. Why? I must know the rules. Once again, Mashwell, I am the engine. So I can change those. I can freely change those algorithms, house rules, variants. Simulation games become historical laboratories following a rational driven. So all those changes, all those evolutions must have a rational base, but it is a free and critical approach. I have a map of Agincourt in Man of Iron. Those are the positions. No, I don't think that those were the positions of Agincourt. How can I do that? Well, I just place the counters in another part of the map. And we have famous mention, famous quotation by Jim Dunnigan. What makes a simulation such a powerful form of communication is that it is, like most events, non-linear. A simulation has many possible outcomes, has many interlocking dynamic processes. And also, this part was in the chapter where Dunnigan was describing war games and simulation games as narrative games. Once again, the player, the narrative. Time and space representation. Let's get to more explicitly nonlinear mechanics. And here we are, Kevin Zucker and Amabel Holland. Kevin Zucker wrote an article on the undetermined nature of counter positions on the map. If you see a counter in one position on the map, it does not mean it is over that hill. Maybe it is in the next X, in the nearby X, around that hill. And what you see is the main possible position of that counter, just like Heisenberg, the Heisenberg determination principle, in that period of time. And here comes Amabel Holland. In an article wrote under the name of Tom Russell, Amabel Holland describes the relativistic flow of events in a turn. Kevin Zucker described this on his online magazine, Wargame Design. Amabel Holland, you can find the article in the Holland-Spiele design blog. And how what is represented as event A, B, C, and D in a war game, possibly they don't happen in that sequence, or they happen simultaneously, but they are physically depicted in other moments. This creates a tension. Why? Because we have to we create a tension between game mechanics and content. Why? Because content is non-linear. Lots of stuff are happening at once, but a game, even if the rules are non-linear, must proceed by a linear way. I have to first move one counter and then move another counter and then make a die roll. And those are events that are materially executed in a linear sequence. This reminds me of an old incident, what I like to call the Subbuteo incident. The first time that me and my father tried to play Subbuteo, we misread one of the rules and we did not move the soccer players alternating each other, but we thought that we had to move them all at once simultaneously. The first one that got the ball and finally could score. In the end, the soccer field was more similar, I think, to the Battle of Agincourt than to an actual soccer field, but it was fun. But you see, there was this tension because all at once we were playing a game that had a linear material sequence of play to represent a nonlinear reality, so everything that is happening during a soccer play in a nonlinear material way, and this is not possible because too many variables come in. So the rules, here is the tension, the rules must remain externally linear, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, step A, step B, step C, but they must recreate an effect, a nonlinear effect, because reality is nonlinear, and the effect, the representation of reality, must be nonlinear too. How do they do? In space, we have fragmented front lines, underground units, hidden units, free movement, true line of sight. Oh, free movement means just like Jutland, Wings of Glory and Sense of Glory. You have a map, no grid, and you move the pieces by rules. Also, the Eagles of the Empire series, in which you move the counters physically on the map inside the small areas of the map, and you cannot put another counter inside an area if it doesn't physically fit in that area, if this area is occupied by another. And the orientation determines front and side and rear of the units. True line of sight. The sign of sight, in some war games is blocked if it crosses the physical representation inside the next. There is a small tiny tree, the line of sight pass through that tree. Yes, it is blocked. Combat Commander as well. Multi-level maps, Pablo's House by David Thompson. You have one strategic map with the entire city, then that gives you resources, then a neighborhood, a second level, second dimension, depicting the neighborhood around Pablo's house with the waves of German soldiers, and then another third dimension, that is the tactical dimension inside the house. The level of space representation. Also dynamic or unknown maps, tiles, and they must be, you go around and the tiles are on the back, and you discover those tiles as soon as you enter into them. Or the map changes based on your decisions. Pax Renaissance, the Enigma system, medieval, but also an unknown maps that is randomly determined by the roles in the science fiction simulation by international team Septima Legio. You have a starship, you go out, and then you map the system and you find what you find. But you have a clear map, you don't even know your starting point. And time and out of time. Asymmetric or flexible turn sequences, action points, action and reaction. If I do one action, my opponent can interrupt me. Difficulties in command and control. Some subordinate commanders may not execute my orders. Cheat or card pool, card or event-driven activations, player-driven activation flow, like the coin wheel, the intensity. If I make an intense action, I can have a similarly intense reaction. So I have to manage escalation or de-escalation. Variable turn length, great prizes of Frederick the Chew. There is an end turn cheat inside the bag, and I don't know how the turn will last. Or even a game end can end abruptly, independently of all the players' decisions. Carrier 44 and Strange Victory. And here we come to the great element of non-linear war games, that is friction. Von Clausewitz, here we go. Our dear friends from Clausewitz, that in On War says everything is very simple in war, but simplest thing is difficult. These difficulties accumulate and produce a friction. This friction distinguishes real war from war on paper. And facts that take place upon which it was impossible to calculate. So nonlinear game mechanics and in general simulations accept the impossible mission of calculate those facts that form friction that are not calculable and represent them on paper to have a plausible simulation. Yes, it is an almost impossible mission, and it is a mission that cannot be accomplished every single way, every single time. It is never accomplished. Accepting a nonlinear approach to simulation means accepting that no simulation is perfect, and that is why we have 10 or 20 different simulations on Waterloo, not just because wargamers are fanatic about that battle. How friction is represented, ponderated randomness, the modifiers and the management. Mark Kaman has written a very interesting article on C3I on how dice are essentially the saving element of strategy, not its death, because you how you put the different modifiers before the die roll, there lies the strategy. risk management in post-Iraq environments, such like in manifest style, or also in sports simulations like Rallyman, fog of war and imperfect information. Great example, Atlantic chase. You do not even know where your ships are, but that was the situation. So you had only trajectories, and inside these trajectories, on a point, there are your own ship. Why? Because you are not in that ship. You are in London, in the Navy headquarters, or you are in Kiel, in the Kriegsmarine headquarters, and you do not know where your ships are. But you must deal with that, give them orders anyway. And sometimes you make actions just to understand where is my ship. Cards as more elaborate narrative vehicles of randomness and most fearful sacrifice is a great example in that, but also for its own CRTs that are disaggregated. They are CRTs with more die rolls inside, because a unit can have great losses, but it doesn't retreat. Another unit can have very small losses, but they are taken by the panic, overtaken by the panic, and they just run away. And this is into that great CRT. This is the most fearful sacrifice, the Blind World series, and study that CRT because it is a very great tool. And Herman Lattmann, the designer, has made a great work on that. It is totally nonlinear. Last type of friction, human friction, the impact of player interactions and metagaming, the player behavior, the player psychology, what happens around the game table. Another typical nonlinear element, parallel and multiple dimension. Hybrid wars call for hybrid war games. Military economics and politics and all their interconnections. Up tempo and its variation. You've seen action, reaction. Many of those elements belong to many different fields. And essentially towards an extended idea what strategy really is. Simultaneous playing on multiple tables. Autonomous, but not, and also autonomous but not independent victory sources, like in Red Flag over Paris, where you can have one side is trying to have a political victory and the other is trying to have a military victory. As in friction, you see how all these nonlinear elements, even if they're not as intuitive as probabilistic and linear elements, they actually reproduce much more things, many more things, directly on the table. Friction is not represented, and parallel and multiple dimensions are not represented just by their effects. I roll a table on a 100 entries, I roll dice and see a 100 entries table and see what happens. No. The entire process is recreated. The entire process is reproduced, is represented, and can be repeated over other plays, other plays of the same game. It is inside the simulation flux, the simulation flow. It is not just an external element. This leads us also to a revision of history, and is also determined by revision of history, of ancient history. Hands in the Sea, First Punic War as a commercial and civic expansion, as a form of conflict. Falling Sky, the coin guy like to call them the Gallic Kongs, just like the Viet Congs. They operate in a very similar way against the Roman Marines. Or as in Time of Crisis, deck building your power base. Time of Crisis on 1066, Tears to Many Manas. In those games, you build your own power base before you get to the direct confrontation. The dynamics of uneasy coalitions. Maria and Friedrich, great games. Wellington on Spain with the British and the Spanish that are not totally aligned. Pax Pamir and all the Pax games. But Pax Pamir is not a really Pax games, just like those of Phil Eklund. Pax Pamir by Colbert gives you a very original view of the Afghanistan conflict, of the conflict in Afghanistan in the 19th century. You are not the British against the Russians. You are the Afghan tribes that sell their services now to the other, and then they wage war against each other, using the Europeans as excuses, as power tools. But this gives us a great byproduct, and because it is a requisite, It is the importance and renewed importance of game bibliography and the diversification of sources. Pax Pamir, Colverle also used material belonging to Afghan historiography, not just Western historiography. And it is very important. This also iconography. Those games have detached the simulation from the classic Hollywood style representation, also thanks to diversification of sources, not just of subjects, but of sources. The same traditional subject is seen in a totally different way. This leads to a dilemma, and once again, great presentation by Fred Serval on the complexity of games, the dilemma of players' workload, Essex paradox. Sometimes it is much more precise to have just one die roll to resolve an action, a complex action, not so many dice rolls resolving all the steps of that situation, because you introduce many more distortions. And Andrea Angiolino's hidden complexity. There is a complexity under the hood of games, but it is not on the player's shoulders. The game has systems to represent that. The different decks compositions of the different aircrafts in Wings of Glory actually represent the different flying behaviors of the aircraft, but the player does not need to study a specific table. He or she has all the cards in the hand and can design, and has all the options, and the special deck is calibrated to give to the player the actual behavior of the aircraft. Many tracks, the political tracks, economic tracks, etc., and interrogation of non-kinetic and kinetic elements. Also, another balancing effects of unbalance, the asymmetries, a practical symmetry, position, assets, information, function, diversified mechanics, peculiar abilities, specific die sets, objective, the victory conditions, but also internal asymmetries. I like to call them asymmetric asymmetries. Untried units, hidden goals, universal or factional event cards, induced asymmetries, unwinnable games. The fact is that in simulations, total imbalance and symmetry, they are not necessary. They're not even desirable. Why? Because historical situations were never balanced. So a totally balanced simulation, in a very linear way, just like Eurogames, is a contradiction in terms. There is no balanced simulation. Unbalance is one of the dynamics that keep a simulation moving, like a reclined plane, since none of the objectives of the player is to, since one of the objectives of the player is to contain, or sometimes even exploit that imbalance. A false sense of security, one player, my side has always won this war, can lead you to a very special victory condition, and this is on the game designer to design conditions that lead to different kinds of victories. Finally, the player elements, the player relationships. PvP, player with player, competitive, not a simple set of goals, but a guideline for gameplay and player interactions. It is not, we are not just collecting points in simulations. Victory conditions exist in simulation to give players a guideline. What should I do exactly? I have the entire map of Greece or colonial America. But what should I do with just my 2 or 3 units? Victory conditions give you this guideline, lead you to a competent, a good behavior that makes the simulation work. And they can be alternative objectives, volatile shifting objectives, hidden objectives, interconnected objectives between alliances and coalitions, progressive objectives. There are thresholds of victory points to gain, otherwise you're out of the game. Many different types of you may see here. And P and P, player and player, cooperative, teamwork, as in quartermaster general. There are no weak factions. Even Italy can have its own role in World War II. The Italian faction has many important cards that serve to the purposes of access. Asymmetries as a strategic asset, the difference of army behavior. Or even if you want, you can even play solitaire games in a community, especially in a schoolroom environment. Semi-cooperative, you can have, as in Churchill, you have the same set of goals, but you are dealing with pulling the rope towards you to have a favorable way to obtain those goals, with or without a traitor. Cross-factional warfare, and as in Pericles, you have different parties of Athens and Sparta. Okay, the war must be won, but it must be one of our conditions. And solitaire, non-linearity in solitaire. Peloponnesian War, I am my own boat. I am Athens, but if I do not win too much, I become Sparta, and then I have to undo all my previous work. Too much victory is not good, as in Churchill in Versailles 1919. Thresholds are mechanism that lead you to that if you win too much, you have actually lost, because you have created an unstable situation after the war. And this happens in those two games that are not incidentally both by Mark Hyman. And induced solitaire, the Stuka-Joe system. Games that are not meant to be solitaire, they become solitaire to, once again, imperfect information. You do not have all the cards open to yourself. And also this is a non-linear way to play a game in a totally different way. I'm going very fast here. Some examples of military non-linear simulations: Battle for Germany, Tom of Arman, Comets and Colors, Hammer of the Scott, Hitler's Reich with the different dimensions of war, Friedrich Maria Segegara we have already met, Undaunted series also we have already met. Battle for Germany is great because you are playing as the Germans and the Soviets, and the Western Allies and the Soviets, and the Western Allies control the Eastern Germans, and the Soviets control the Western German forces, and each tries to obstacle itself, to hinder itself. Very interesting non-linear mechanic in a very traditional war game. 1970s war game, by the way. Political nonlinear simulations, 1960, War for Consent, Optimatus and Populares. War for Consent is many victims in Rome. If you got a category of people unhappy, you didn't last long. Biologically, in a very biological sense of the word. Democracy under siege, how politics did not avoid the war between the First and the Second World War. For Sumter, how politics started the war with a crisis, the secession crisis. Wir sind das Volk by Richard Sivell is the same game designer of Marian Friedrich. The contagion of political system. If the capitalist system of West Germany is successful, even Eastern Germany becomes unstable. Pax Emancipation, a very precise historical thesis. This in this case, on the slavery and the end of slavery, on the end of organized slavery in the modern war, and Root. Root is a great game. This is not just kittens and bears, but it is actually a power struggle. Economical non-linear simulations. For Rex, you're speculating on the expectations of other future speculations. Food chain magnate, Pax Renaissance, how economy shaped the world. Wings of the Baron, which you are managing one of the enterprises that they create weapons, a military industrial complex. John Company, negotiations and ruthless exploitment of an entire continent. Grid Incorporated, 18x6, the railways. Grid Incorporated is interesting because you run a company just for your profit. Sometimes it is better for you to let that company go bankrupt and carry on with the game. And narrative, other kinds of games. The Hunters Beneath the Mad, those are narrative solitaire games. American Tank Case 2, it is a bit more tactical choices. Legion of Honor, Life and Death and Times of Napoleon, and you control an officer of Napoleon and his life and his adventures, less like a novel, and try to avoid getting beheaded in the revolution, for example, or sent to Spain. And also two great and not really war games, but two great games about war: The Grizzled and This War of Mine, War on the Consequences of Military Personnel and Civilian Populations. Ancient Civilizations of the Inner Sea, spectrum, the great spectrum of war domination in the ancient war. There is religion, economic, and military and politics, and also Game of Thrones, the board game, diplomacy with dragons, but also with great negotiations and supply concern, etc. We're coming to the end. Okay, to the end of this presentation. Why should we look for nonlinear simulation? Why are we bothering so much with nonlinear simulations? And meaning in Italian, I'm sorry, but I could not avoid Sergio Leone quotation. The good elements, the good aspects. This gives us a broader sense of wargaming, approaching nonlinear wargames. Really, where no hexagon has gone before. Hexagon are fine, they are great, but they have their own field of application, going beyond the hexagon or taking the hexagon with those mechanics, because many of those games have hexagons. They're actually hexagon counter war games, and if they have cards, well, when no hexagon has gone before, we are exploring the CRT, the hidden side, the far side of the CRT, escaping the dreadful factor counting and 3-to-1 trap that is all too common in war games. We love the cards because they introduce so many elements, but it also gives us another vision of reality. What is realism? The difference between detailed and accurate. A detailed game may not be an accurate simulation. Too much details. The game gives you too much details, puts you in too many shoes. Possibly it is not a good simulation. Why? Because the decision makers had not so much information. They did not know so many things, or detail becomes too much. It cannot be managed by players. The difference, multiple diversified and interconnected aspects of reality. Playability is transformed into a new kind of detail. Why? Because this is field science work. If a game is simple enough and it is manageable, this becomes a new kind of detail because it puts you exactly in the shoes of the decision maker. Generally, Robert E. Lee had not a CRT before he ordered Pickett charge. Possibly, if he had a very accurate and detailed CRT, he would have never ordered Pickett's charge. He ordered that on intuition, on analogy, and a game that puts you into that mindset, that much more non-linear, non-exactly probabilistic mindset, is a much more accurate simulation than that totally probabilistic simulation that takes into account each and every detail, because it influences your decision process. And that is life, actually, a new kind of mathematics and statistics based on human interactions, and not just numbers, but numbers remain. There are still probabilistic functions. There is still an algorithm. It is just based on human interaction and perception. A better comprehension of human interaction in an elaborated but accurate competition. It is also an ideal test field for behavioral sciences, analyzing decision processes, biases, nudging techniques, fast and slow thinking. If you free yourself from just the probabilities, just from the linear mathematical analysis, and you get on the also on the organic analysis, on other forms of statistics, and on the analysis of human interactions, then you get to a new field of research, of studies. And you understand the Gattaca effect. I don't know if you remember that the movie Gattaca, how life will always find a way against all formal regulations. Biology, analogic thinking, lateral thinking, parallel thinking will always overtake formal regulations, formal linear regulations. The bad stuff that can happen, the objective risks, too much abstraction, too many dimensions, interdependencies, they create distortions. They create a night in which all the cows are black because there is so many different levels of interactions that people do not understand them. A designer can have a bit an excess of personal influence on historical vision, on content, on gameplay. There is less space for player input and game customization because it is much harder. This is much harder to change the game. And also the game does not work on established design conventions, and this leads to player disorientation. Everybody knows how a wax war game works. It is very intuitive. Already a card-driven game can be a bit more complex. Let's not talk about the complexities of a coin game. There are also subjective risks. Daedalus, what I like to call the Daedalus pitfall. You lose the players in the labyrinth on your own making. They do not know how to exit in this labyrinth of different and interconnected functions. You ask too much to the players. You have to fly them to ag, and then you have the Icarus effect. The main focus here is content economy. If there is not enough content economy, you get slightly out of focus, as Frank Capra said, with too many elements to manage and account for. This leads to the asymmetries in the game can lead to asymmetries in the game perception by the players and their game understanding, and so the decision processes, they become inaccurate or random or arbitrary or totally against the purposes of the simulation, and the simulation fails. Also, another important aspect of better culture, when dealing with obscure topics, that is a typical factor of non-linear games, you don't leave the players in the dark. They must have some of a relation to that topic, or if they don't have, they must create them. But you must always take into account the cultural heritage as players. Players coming from a Western culture may not know many things about the intricate history and very fascinating history of East Asia. You must take that into account. Yes, it is a non-linear element of the game, the relationship between the players and the game, but it is a very important aspect of game design. And then the usual distortions of multiplayer games, not just them, alpha players, king makers, the experience domination, expert players, they tend to win every single time, and there are some small wrong moves that put you out of the play completely, overviews, winning strategies, the possibility of card counting, etc. And also the relation between game designers and their own mistakes in gaming, scripted games, combinatorial accesses, to convoluted innovations. And the ugly, this is the last element. The ugly, why ugly? Because they're not so horrible, but they can be uncomfortable. Games should be fun. Non-linear games are fun, but they are very engaging. They tend to be very engaging. They have a new meaning of engaging. Deep, they are deep, they can become too deep. They're immersive, they can become too immersive. This War of Mine is a great game about the consequences of war on civilization population. It can be too much for some players. And also this tends to raise the bar in expectations for new games. And this leads to complexity stratification. Oh, I want a game about economy. Oh, I want a game about economy and the relationship between politics and economy. Oh, I want a game about economy, the relationship between politics and economy and religion too, and so on and so on and so on. Some games can become dangerous. That is, they tend to give you a very, as we have said in World War I, cynical approach to themes and setting, a critical and disenchanted approach to history and reality. They can tackle very sensitive topics. If we broaden our spectrum of topics in a simulation, we can even include some very uneasy, difficult topics. But we must stay accurate, and so it is much more difficult. Games can become unpopular culture products. Games are popular culture products. They are based on popular culture. What we have seen now, the general public sees an event, an historical event. But if you take an alternative route, even if it is more accurate, this can become unpopular. So you have to compensate for this. You have to give some reference points. You must let the players understand why there is this other alternative vision. This happened to Aaron Buchanan with Liberty of Death. Many people said, oh, why? The Americans are not chasing the British like the Patriot. No, because they did not in the American Revolution. They chased the Indians, the Native Americans, what they call them Indians. And this is much more accurate. It's very much more accurate. I love that game exactly for these reasons. The problem is that this is not the popular vision of the American Revolution, because the popular vision is the Patriot, Mel Gibson chasing, hunting for the redcoats. Well, it was exactly the opposite. And finally, if I can't play, it's not my revolution. There are revolutions, innovations, and a new concept of tradition as a constant innovation. We are coming back to the 70s, to the golden age in this respect, but it is very unorthodox. We must avoid it, throw the X out with the bathwater. The hexagons, the traditional systems, as you have seen, they have very, very broad spectrums of applications where also great elements of nonlinearity, but they're still valid and excellent. I love playing X and counter war games, and I love how they represent those particular aspects of reality. They represent them better than nonlinear simulations. But and we must not go in excess for our drive towards innovation. Unconventional approaches can lead to a new type of hyper specialization. I play just card-driven war games. That is fine, but also non-linear simulation are one subset of simulation. There are many other subsets. We must not over-specialize. We must avoid, once again, game tribalism. And finally, a new, and sometimes can be painful, awareness of historical and current events. And it is very, very important. It is almost a challenge to the players. Sometimes linear simulations are reassuring, non-linear simulations can be disconcerting. And this leads to my conclusion, to my final conclusion, a misquotation of Shakespeare. There are more things in heaven heard than are dreamt of in your war games. Non-linear simulations lets us understand that our knowledge of reality is limited because reality has infinite complexities, and also our simulations have to be limited. But accepting these limits, and it is very linear, we are actually creating more complete, more accurate simulations. Thank you. I hope to have been quite clear. Yeah, the topic is very great. Sometimes it is a bit disorienting for myself. Sometimes it is a labyrinth. After all, that is why I called that book the Ariadne's game. But it is a very fascinating field of research, and much more research can and should be done on this field. Thank you very much.
Hey, Ricardo, thank you. I have a couple questions that I see in the chat that I want to ask you. First, it says, I think the presentation was excellent, broad-ranging. Do you think there is a time penalty for non-linear games? For example, does it take longer to play in general?
Not necessarily. Usually, yes. The problem is that the perception of time by the players is much different. In a linear simulation, I'm going over and over and over the same procedures, the same mechanics. In a non-linear games, I have so many different mechanics all happening at once or parallel. So possibly I do not have a perception of time. I don't think I'm playing it so much time, but they tend to be longer. Actually, they tend to be longer because you have also more phenomena of analysis paralysis. Oh, now what do? I have so many things to see. You have many different sub games into that. So it is not true. We must never forget that the traditional war games were born in the 70s, and they were playable in 1 hour, 1 hour and a half, 2 hours at maximum, most of them. Non-linear simulations can be short, can be brief if they are designed that way, but if they are not designed that way, they usually tend to go over the 6-8 hours limits. That is a normal limit for a coin game. You have different scenarios, a short, a medium, and the long scenarios. The long scenarios, I think, that require 6 to 8 hours. This is not a short game, as I see it. So it is not necessary, and they're not necessarily shorter. We must not get a misconception that non-linear games are simpler games. Sometimes they are apparently simpler, but the many more times are much more complex and so require much more time to play.
The next question sort of asks, should we not be more concerned with the effects and the details of how we arrived at the result? The result creates the challenge to the gamer as to how we must deal with the result.
Yes, we should be concerned, but we should be this once again the expectation as a player. You can content yourself. Okay, I just want to deal with the consequences. I'm not interested in all the details of how I get from A to B. But for other players, the game is not how I get from A to B. It's not if I do A, I get B. For other gamers, the game is exactly what happens from A to B. It is there is no fixed rule. That is why linear games are just as valid as non-linear games, as deterministic games. Many people are perfectly happy to play chess. I hate chess personally, but it is not why, because they have a certain set of expectations. If we are dealing with simulations, so we have a purpose, it depends. So we have a clear purpose, that is the reproducible, to have an accurate enough reproduction of the world that is manageable, that it can be influenced by us. It depends on what we are looking for in a game. Many times we play a game even before opening the box. When we are the first game, the first turn of a game, something like a turn 0, is when I have my shelf of games, and then they say, okay, tonight, okay, I play this. Why? Because I want this kind of simulation. Sometimes if I want one kind of simulation, just dealing with the effects, with the consequences, okay, I get this game. No, I'm more interested in the process, in seeing the process, how I can change, I can actually manipulate the different outcomes of my choices. Okay, please, I play this other game. It is all in the player's mind. It all starts from the player.
The next question is, how does a gamer or game designer know when their game is too deep, right? How does a game designer know where that line is, where they should stop tinkering with it, adding complexity to it, and so forth?
They usually, game designers, I'm not a game designer, okay? I like to call myself a game critic, but most of all, a player, a game user. The problem is, if a game designer starts with a purpose, he knows exactly, or she knows exactly when to stop. What is the limit? What am I trying to represent in this game? Okay, this is enough. The problem is that enough is never enough. The love for detail, maybe during your research, you say, oh, there is this other field I never even dreamt of. I must include that. That is why there are people like developers and playtesters, two categories that are not very much, two very noble categories in the game design process, that today I see there are some very good game developers and some very good playtesters, but sometimes I see games that have a great idea, but they have too much stuff in it. Why? Because there was not a good developer that cut all the unnecessary stuff, nor good playtesters that told the game designers, hey, this is too much. We are at turn 2, and we already don't know absolutely what is happening. And we cannot manage it. We cannot have any influence over it. Once again, economy of content. There is a certain quantitative and qualitative limit to the cognitive processes of an average person, and you are still into field science territory. You must still stay in that field. It is not easy, nor for the game designers, nor for the game players. As we have seen, there are many more expectations over expectation. But once again, for some players, it is enough. For some other players, it is not enough. Once again, a game can be good for a certain kind of people and bad, and very bad for another kind of people. There are expert wargamers who love Undaunted, and other expert wargamers that hate Undaunted. Always for the same reasons, seen in opposite ways.
So someone wanted to ask, you listed Jim Dunnigan's R-Rev 1775 to 1783 as being a Eurogame before its time. I was curious to learn more about this since I don't know anything about this game. Can you expand on that?
Yes, because it had area movement, it had generic pieces. The entire enlistment process was was dependent on the political situation. It had resource management to have data listing process, and it looked very, very, I'm not saying similar because they did not copy, but the approach was the same as 1775 rebellion by Academy Wargames, that is considered just like 1878 Vikings, a very light war games with many small elements of Eurogame mechanics in it, but not just American Revolution, but also another game that I mentioned is Spies. We have a set of spies that are going all over Europe before World War II, gathering intelligence, gathering small pieces of intelligence over the map, and then they collect that pieces of information. They take them back to their own headquarters. It looks like a pick up and deliver game. That is, we are absolutely in Eurogame territory. As Catan started its life as a game, as a war game, this is what happened, and then they took out all the war game elements. Many of the what we now call Eurogame mechanics were actually derived from what in the 70s and the early 80s were considered war games. There is not a clear boundary, and there are not Eurogame mechanics and war game mechanics. The same mechanics can be more or less simulative, more or less of a simulation, depending on how it is used in the general economy of the game. There are many Euro games that use hexagons and counters, and there are not war games, and there are many war games that do not use nor hexes nor counters, and they are legitimate war games. It all depends on how a design tool, a game mechanic as a design tool, is used inside the general economy of the game design.
So do you have any last minute parting comments to our audience about nonlinear gaming, as I wait for the last minute questions to come through the chat, if there's any last ones? But otherwise, I want to give you the last comment.
Yeah, thank you very much. Once again, I repeat myself. This must not be interpreted as this presentation must not be interpreted as non-linear games. Simulation games are the future of war gaming. All the previous kinds of war games are not good simulations. Not at all. There are different types of simulations for different purposes, for different aspects of reality. I like to make a parallel with the mechanical physics, Newtonian physics, and quantum physics. Okay, when in relativity, when all those different theories came one after the other, they did not they did not destroy, invalidate the previous theories. They just gave us different sets to see different aspects of reality. The Newtonian law of gravity is still valid, it still works, even if you have relativity, even if you have quantum physics, and they tell us that in other aspects, in other fields of reality, Newtonian laws of gravity do not work, but they're still there. They still rule over our own life, and they are still the most useful tool to describe how gravity in a planet and in the universe works. So what I'm saying is that nonlinear simulations have a very have a possibly greater spectrum of simulations. They can include many more elements, but they have many more risks of distortions. They can be much less valid than linear probabilistic simulations. It is just a matter of what do you expect from a game. The final message is a game is as valid as the players that are playing it. The simulation effect of a simulation of a war game depends not on the rules, also on the rules, but not only on the rules, but most of all depends on the player's mindset, on the player's expectations, on the player's attitude, on the player's interactions, on the player's perception of the game. The subjective side of a game is still the center, is still the focus. We must not be too focused on the rules, because we can change the rules, but it's much harder to change ourselves. ourselves and how we see the world and how we see a game and the interaction. But they are much more interesting fields of study and research, even than the games themselves. Players' interactions are the key.
Hey, Ricardo, I would like to thank you for spending your evening and our morning with us on this presentation. And I would like to thank our audience for the great questions. And I appreciate everyone. And for those who will need to catch the rest of the video, you watch us on YouTube. And thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you very much. And thank you once again for this opportunity. And goodbye to everybody. And also, Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Ciao.